mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for spending your lunchtime hour with us today. My name is Gwen Koslowski, and I work for the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program, a collaborative initiative of the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation and the University of Vermont Extension. To find out more about our program, please visit vtcommunityforestry.org. Today's webinar presentation is titled Managing Diverse Viewpoints, Decision-Making, and Best Practices on Volunteer Boards. Our presenter today is Emily Silver Huff, Research Forester with the USDA Forest Service and Adjunct Faculty Member at the University of Massachusetts. Emily holds a PhD in Forestry from the University of Maine, specializing in human dimensions of forestry, and an MS in Forest Management from the University of Minnesota. She is currently part of the Family Forest Research Center, where she works on the National Woodland Owner Survey and related efforts to better understand the decisions of private forest landowners nationwide. Her work uses mixed methods, including large-scale surveys, in-depth interview techniques, and focus groups. She has worked with intergroup dynamics and decision-making processes on several projects, including a new national effort to better understand urban residential landowners' attitudes, behaviors, and perceptions of their green space and trees. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few logistics of the webinar. As participants, your microphones will be muted during the presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box or the questions box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar side panel. At the end of Emily's presentation, she will address the questions in the order in which they came. After the presentation, you will be sent an email with a link to a very short evaluation survey. Please fill this survey out so that we can continue to improve our future webinars and programming. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, vtcommunityforestry.org, as a YouTube video by the end of the week. With that, I'll hand it over to Emily.
All right, thank you, Gwen, and good afternoon, everybody. I'll just add to that excellent bio. Part of the inspiration for me to present on this important topic is the urban work that Gwen mentioned, working with the urban version of the National Woodland Owner Survey to better understand the motivations and attitudes of residential green space owners, we call them. And in that work, I've had the opportunity to lead some focus groups with key stakeholders, many of whom are volunteer tree board members. So I've been just absolutely thrilled to work with volunteer tree board members and to hear their perspectives, and my research will hopefully inform the work that you all do. In addition to that, I've done social science research now for about 5 or 6 years, and will share some of that research with you today as it applies to decision making and managing diverse viewpoints and conflict. So let's get started with a quick overview of some of the topics I'm going to be speaking about today. These are just general topics, not necessarily in sort of a research format, but I'd like to introduce you to some of the key findings in the fields of decision-making research, talk a little bit about the different roles that volunteer boards and members can take depending on the goals, the typical sources of conflict, and then I'd also like to hear from you about what your typical sources of conflict are in your work, and then offer strategies both from a preparation perspective, so prior to making a big decision or holding a meeting, some strategies for how to deal with conflict in real time, and then some strategies for after a meeting concludes or after a decision has been made, and then finally, what can you do to institutionalize some of these strategies into the processes within which you currently or must work. So at the broadest level, starting with decision making, the two fields of research that I believe have the most to bear on the decision making process is the field of economics, very, very generally, and also psychology. In economics, for those of you who've had any coursework in that topic or have come across sort of sound bites in the news, you may have heard the word utility. So economists use the phrase utility functions to describe this concept that people maximize utility by assessing expected values of each outcome. This, of course, makes a couple of key assumptions. The first being that people are choosing between fixed and known alternatives. They know all of the possible expected outcomes there might be to a decision. The second huge assumption is that people are rational, which we all know is not necessarily the case. But these two assumptions are really important when setting up the statistical and mathematical foundations of kind of quantifying what the utility of an expected outcome might be. So there's a great body of literature on how and why and to what degree people make decisions based on these utility functions, and some of those may have interesting insights in the field of environmental research and more specifically in forestry. Then on the other side is this psychological perspective. So this kind of takes away that assumption of people as rational thinkers who know every possible alternative and posits that there are a number of cognitive factors or factors that people consider sort of internally based on things like contextual factors, so what is the environment in which someone is making a decision, personal factors, so every person has a unique suite of characteristics, both from a kind of a demographics perspective, but also the way we think, the way we process information. People are often influenced by things like social norms, beliefs, values. People hold attitudes and biases. And these are all, in many cases, quantified and used in experimental settings to understand how people make decisions and what those decisions tend to be given a particular suite of these so-called cognitive factors. And at the bottom of this screen and in some subsequent screens, there'll be some references to point you to kind of the theoretical underpinnings of these things, and I'll list those references on a slide at the end, so you can go and look those up if you are interested. So what I just presented was kind of a perspective from an individual standpoint. So when an individual goes to make a decision, what are they thinking about? But one of the things that's really key in the decision-making process on boards and in group settings is how a group gets together and walks through the decision-making process. So there are about as many decision-making model process diagrams as there are groups of people, but this is one that kind of boils down a lot of them and borrows pretty heavily from the business and marketing world, where decisions are made frequently, rapidly, and often without a whole lot of information, in contrast to kind of the research world, where decisions, or the management world based on research, where decisions are often based on lots and lots and lots of prior research, etc. But the process generally looks the same, and if you start there at the top in the dark blue circle with defining or clarifying what it is you're trying to make a decision about, or maybe you don't even know at that point that you are making a decision. The next step, ideally, in the decision-making process is to gather up the facts. Sometimes these are already known, sometimes they actually need to be collected, and in the most extreme cases, facts need to be generated, knowledge needs to be created, whether it's through research or summarization of existing knowledge. Next would be brainstorming options and solutions. So once the facts are at hand, some solutions may be readily apparent, others may not be. And then comparing those solutions, maybe making a list of pros and cons, maybe just a simple discussion of the options and whether or not they're viable. It's not a very exciting color, but the real key in this diagram is decide. So after these kind of 4 initial steps, a decision may or may not be made, and then followed by implementation of that decision if it's something that leads to a kind of on-the-ground action. Evaluation and follow-up may lead to the beginning of the process, the need to actually redefine the problem, make a new decision, or in some cases I think that arrow could even not exist. You evaluate, you follow up, and you say, okay, this is how this decision went, for better or worse, let's move on with our lives. So that's one way to think about the decision-making process, and I'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about how groups can get together and maybe initiate some best practices around each of these steps. So now I'll move into thinking about different roles for different goals. And here I'm going to refer to roles either as the role of your board or in some cases the role of the individuals within the board, kind of the team members may have different goals. But what I'm going to say applies to thinking about the whole unit, the whole board, and also the individuals within the group. So this circles of engagement slide draws pretty heavily on an emerging body of research, of literature on stakeholder engagement. So that can be an organization trying to decide who has a stake in what they do, what they are responsible for doing, or in terms of research, it could mean how does the research team make their research relevant to other people. So stakeholder engagement has a lot of different perspectives that all feed into it. But the circles of engagement walks through like this. At the very outer level is simple information sharing. So it's not a high level of engagement. It has to do with one group sharing knowledge with a person that has to make a decision or sharing knowledge with the general public. The next level of engagement nested inside of that information sharing, and so this walks in with kind of the least amount of engagement to the most, the biggest kind of stake in the decision, is joint fact-finding. So if we need to gather information, maybe we can do this together, maybe there's some input coming from both sides, or in some cases there's actual research that needs to take place, and that could be done together. The next level is consulting and engaging. So not just finding results, but interpreting those results and providing consultation about the facts that have been gathered or generated. The next would be consensus building. So this starts to get into the real kind of decision-making process, and when an agreement of sorts needs to be reached, or maybe a decision is put forth and people need to decide how they feel about it. But that really has to do with building consensus among disparate groups or disparate stakeholders. And finally, implementation is at that point, again, after a decision has been made, and you can actually implement whatever it is you've decided upon together. That doesn't necessarily mean everyone shares equal parts in the labor, but they all have responsibility for whatever decision takes place. To kind of build out from that a little bit more, here's some examples, some concrete examples of the goals of those different levels of engagements. So thinking about that outer ring of information sharing, that could be holding a public meeting where maybe there's a little bit of discussion, but the real goal is to present information that's been gathered and assembled by one party. Let's say it's your board. Similarly, poster boards, printed brochures, that type of thing. The goal is to inform. It's a way of engaging because you're being transparent, you're not sort of doing things behind closed doors, but it doesn't necessarily invite a lot of collaborative effort. The joint fact-finding could relate to going on a site tour, hosting a technical workshop, technical advisory committees, and that's sort of one role I think that boards play, but there's also opportunity to bring in additional expertise even within a tree board that could constitute that deeper level of engagement. There's dialogue, so that may include actual workshops or tools where you're getting feedback, you're holding focus groups, the consensus building where you're actually getting together, conferencing, starting to make decisions, and then finally partnerships, and this could be joint studies, it could be joint funding to actually carry out a particular activity or a decision. Okay, I'm going to move into sources of conflict now that we've sort of talked about engagement and decision making. And this slide has on the left-hand side some bullet points that I'm going to put up here that I think of as kind of the positive reasons for conflict. Often there's true diversity of membership in all of the senses of that word. It could be different backgrounds from a financial perspective, socioeconomic perspective, cultural perspective, professional perspective, etc. People that join volunteer boards are passionate, deeply passionate, and very, very caring. That's also a source of conflict. Passion often leads to very, very strong feelings about an outcome as those outcomes are weighed and balanced. Generally, these groups are non-hierarchical and inclusive. There are often reasons that somebody would join versus another person, so it's not necessarily a fully public group, but they're meant to be a situation where everyone has more or less equal decision-making power. So that's obviously difficult. In hierarchies, it's very easy to just say, this is what we're going to do, and it moves on down the chain. I know in the Forest Service, that's a more familiar model to me, at least. The shared leadership aspect is sort of a subset of that non-hierarchical bullet point, and it just basically, if there are multiple leaders in a group, there's often more of an environment and context for conflict. Now here on the right-hand side are some of the more negative sides of sources of conflict. So often there's a lack of information, there's different views about what is important, different interpretations about what is important, and those different worldviews that come out of the wonderful diversity of membership. And these are all bullet points that have been sort of collated by a couple great resources for conflict resolution. Again, that's curated on the final slide of this presentation. So now I'm also going to talk about some of the broad categories, these sources of conflict. And when I'm done with this slide, these are the categories that I'd like you to weigh in and let me know which of these categories are common sources of conflict for you and your work. And then what I'm going to do is compile that on the next slide so that when these slides are available online, we can show a little bit of data from the attendees here on this call about what are some of these typical sources of conflict and how common are they. So when I talk about data conflict, what I really mean is, do you have all of the information you need? Are the data that you're gathering conflicting? In some cases, the jury's still out on a particular outcome, and so some person might have one study that says one thing and someone brings a study that says another. Interest conflicts, fairly straightforward. Some people are interested and others are completely apathetic and disinterested in a particular decision-making aspect. There are also varying levels of interest. It doesn't necessarily have to be binary or dichotomous, disinterested versus interested. Some people could be moderately interested while others are very interested. And then of course there's its own special category of special interest where some people have a disproportionately high interest in a particular outcome or of a decision. For structural conflicts, that could be anything from meeting spaces, members who are remote, who have a hard time getting to meetings, impossibility of scheduling, things that are sort of do not have to do with the people once they're sitting in the meeting, but how does the meeting come together? How is a decision made kind of structurally and logistically? Value conflicts, so I haven't covered very deeply the notion of values, attitudes, beliefs that I mentioned when talking about the psychology of decision making, but values are the things that are deeply rooted and you can almost think of as being fairly permanent. Attitudes are more or less changeable in a person's life, and as new information is received, attitudes are often updated, whereas values are things that are set fairly early on and established based on a person's environment and early experiences. So those value conflicts may arise from cultural perspectives or deeply rooted beliefs about a particular outcome. For relationship conflicts, that one's also fairly straightforward. Personal clashes and pre-existing relationships between individuals. So I think, Gwen, if we can initiate the poll, and this is the slide that I spoke of where I will collect the number of people who shared that they experienced that source of conflict in their work, just so you can get a sense of how your kind of peer group is experiencing these conflicts. So I think I'll give it 1 minute to see if that works. Oh, great. It says poll is in progress. So I'll give you a minute to just think through when those conflicts, or which of those conflicts have come up for you in your work. And that will also help me because I can speak more specifically to those and will be prepared to answer more questions about those. Okay. Excellent. So I'm seeing that the majority, percentage-wise, listed interest conflicts and value conflicts. That is really fascinating to me. In my setting up of a hypothesis, I thought that relationship conflicts would end up being a lot more common than it was. So I'll speak a little bit more to interest and value conflicts, and I will post these on the slide after the webinar concludes. So, oh, thank you. Gwen's a magician. All right. So here are some things, and I'll speak more to the interest and values since that's what folks are experiencing a bit more. Here are some of the things that are suggested in terms of dealing with these typical sources of conflict. So data conflicts, gathering and reconciling data differences, it seems simple, but it is definitely a challenging task, and that's where I recommend everyone finding what are the resources that you trust? Is it extension professionals? Is it a university partner? Is it a nonprofit that's working in this world? Is it your urban forester? And trusting them to provide you with good information, but also being your own kind of critical thinker. For the interest conflicts, in a lot of the conflict resolution literature and kind of best practices, acknowledging special interests is very, very important. So not necessarily giving, you want to strive for equal airtime, but to give special interests the opportunity to put them out there and say, this is what I care deeply about or have a vested interest in some cases. I know it's often done up front when somebody joins a board to find out what those conflicts of interest are, but sometimes they evolve and they change. So acknowledging them is really important, and simply by acknowledging them, often the person who holds that interest is able to eventually recognize that they in fact are a special interest as opposed to kind of a more moderate weighing, balancing, maybe level on an emotional scale for the outcome that's up for consideration. Another is to assign tasks based on those interests, so to capitalize on that interest. Maybe there are things you can do as a group, but to send members out to complete tasks, whether it's gathering data, whether it's listing out pros and cons, whether it's coming up with options. If there is somebody that's interested in something, they're much more likely to take a very active role in that. And so harnessing that energy is a way that I've found to reduce conflict in a decision-making environment. Structural, adjusting meeting space using technologies like this, like webinars and web communications to facilitate meetings. There's many, many others that I'm sure you can think of in your own situations to make life easier, make it so that you can focus on the decision and not on the revolving context of the board. For those value conflicts, discussing viewpoints as opposed to trying to be that rational decision maker, so allowing everybody to say what their view is on a particular thing, but in a very circumspect way. So, you get your airtime, but then we're going to move on, and then opening it for discussion at the end. I think allowing for dissent is very important and listed in many best practice documents. So that may mean defining what consensus means. I know in my work it can mean that everybody agrees, but if two people disagree, they have to say they disagree but allow for consensus. It could mean a majority type vote. It could mean many things, but defining that before you begin a decision-making process is very important. And maybe that threshold for consensus changes based on the importance or the severity of the decision that's being considered. For relationship conflicts, having a neutral facilitator and identifying common ground, there's a surprising amount of common ground that you don't realize until you seek to identify it that can often help overcome a conflict. All right, so thinking about some strategies now that we've talked a lot about conflict, in preparation for, I'll call it a meeting, a decision, etc. Sometimes the decision that's at hand may seem like all you need to meet and figure out, but there may be components to that decision that require a special meeting. Maybe that involves everybody on the team, maybe it doesn't, but although we all try and avoid having too many meetings, 20 minutes of special preparation can mean a world of difference in a subsequent meeting that may slog on for 2 hours without that kind of convening of the subtopic or the special interest. On the other hand, not holding secret meetings is very important for all members to more or less know what's going on at all times and not feel like they've walked into a meeting blind where 3 members have met about something and they weren't privy to that information. I know a lot of groups take minutes, and in my case, when I have facilitated working group meetings, I often audio record the meetings, but it's actually advisable when those tough conversations have to happen to skip the minutes, to just say, we're not going to carefully document this process because we want people to feel comfortable saying things that they might not otherwise. Of course, then when the true decision is made, it's very important to document that process, but it's okay sometimes to skip that when tough conversations need to take place. I'm going to touch more on picking a neutral facilitator in the next slide. But there's also identifying those sources of conflicts that I listed in that you were polled on to prepare your materials to overcome this conflict. So the group, if they know there's a data conflict or they know there's a values conflict, to figure out what is the missing data, what are those values to overcome this conflict. You can do that in the preparatory stages, not just the meeting itself. So in real time, so when you're sitting there making a decision or having a meeting about something, I think of running meetings like I run focus groups, and it's worked pretty well for me outside of the research setting, in settings where decisions are trying to be made. So going back to that previous bullet point, who should facilitate or lead a particular meeting? Again, this may seem like an obvious list, but sometimes it's actually helpful to have a checklist when you're picking somebody to lead, So listening attentively, it's not a skill that there are folks on my research team who will fully admit that they have a lot of difficulty listening attentively and that they don't identify as a sensitive or empathetic person. So maybe they're not the best choice to lead. You have to be able to listen and think at the same time. Also, a fairly challenging skill, and that many will self-admit is not something they're able to do. You have to truly believe that all participants have something to offer. They may not have the precise expertise on a particular decision, but everybody is there for a reason. Having adequate knowledge of the topic, so if you're trying to make a decision about tree species to plant, having somebody that's at least comfortable and familiar with what the options might be in your town, in your area, is beneficial. Someone that can check their ego at the door. No one's perfect at this, but that's certainly an ingredient for a good facilitator. And somebody who can relate but also give authority. So often we trust people that have had experiences in or knowledge of the topic that's being discussed. Someone who isn't the supervisor of anyone present, I don't know if that's so much the case in these volunteer boards, but it's very important to just keep in mind what the power dynamics are outside of the group and appropriately managing challenging group dynamics, and I'm going to speak more to that on the next several slides. So here are the common challenges that I've encountered and that I find even more evidence for in some of the best practices I've found. The self-appointed expert. So what do you do when somebody comes in and says, I'm an expert about something, and you may or may not believe that they truly are? One of the things that I will say is just simply to thank them, but then asking, what do other people think? A lot of people don't like to be called upon to weigh in on something. You might assume that somebody will speak up if they have something to say, but we all know from, I think, our own experiences that sometimes we're just either waiting, we're thinking, we're hesitating, we feel dominated by the self-appointed expert, etc. So simply asking, what do other people think, or targeting people and saying, what do you think, Nancy, about this particular issue? Following closely on that is the dominator, somebody that speaks often or even speaks loudly or speaks with authority, not necessarily from an expertise point, but just their tone and mannerisms. So another simple one, let's have some other comments. Doesn't need to be confrontational, but let's hear from others in the room. The rambler, so somebody who goes on and on about a particular topic or seems to take the conversation down unexpected twists and turns. So with this, I do a couple of things. Sometimes I will very purposefully break eye contact if I'm facilitating or leading a meeting. I will make it pretty obvious that I'm looking at a watch or clock, which may seem rude, but is a very, very important social signal to somebody. And waiting for an inhale to jump in and either move the conversation forward, call on somebody else, or present a kind of transition in the group dynamics. In contrast to the dominant participator, there's a shy participator at every meeting. So that is a case where you'd actually want to make eye contact or at least ask them a very concrete question with a helpful prompt. So if you're trying to make a decision about who to bring in on a particular topic, say, do you know anybody from your work doing XYZ? Or another common way to overcome shyness and reticence to participate is asking everyone to go around in turn. And finally, there's the quiet talker. Very similar to the shy participant, this is somebody that will try and jump in and say something, but are just practically and logistically difficult to hear. So that's again really important to have that leader facilitator who can listen and talk at the same time and think at the same time, and will catch that and ask them to repeat their comments so that everyone can appreciate it. And not to call them out for being too shy or quiet, but just saying we all really do want to hear what you have to say. A few other helpful hints that I've gathered in my work facilitating and running workshops and meetings is building in breaks. The value of, and I'm sure many of you have sort of done this subconsciously, of stepping away from the table. It could be to end a meeting, or it could simply be a 10-minute, everyone get some water, go to the bathroom, call your family, etc. But to come back after a little time has passed can be extremely helpful and will actually save you time in the long run. Again, that reminding each other of common ground does require you to find that common ground first, but bringing everybody back to a place of positivity can be very helpful. Taking a step back from not just a break, but taking a step back from the topic at hand. So maybe things have gotten down along that decision process, that decision-making pathway, and you say, you know, here we are listing the pros and cons, but I don't think we've even identified some of the possible solutions. It can seem like you're making obviously negative progress, but taking that step back often will lead to the best solution. And having explicit goals that allows discussion of viewpoints, but also puts them aside, noting that many, if not most, decisions require compromise and require a form of consensus that does not mean that everyone will agree. So after a meeting or after a decision takes place or part of that decision-making process, don't let the unresolved issues simmer. So although I've just said that taking a break can help, letting them simmer sort of means weeks and weeks on end or months on end for something to go unresolved or at least hasn't been addressed by the group. Also, kind of back to that point I made about secret meetings, if something is resolved outside a group meeting, say two of your members meet up in the grocery store and say, I've been thinking about this, I think you might be right, or at least I want to talk about it in this way, make sure you bring that to the group and let them know that it's either been resolved or that you've had that conversation. Also very important to highlight the successes that you've had as a team. It doesn't have to be overly patting each other on the back and all of that, but to at least acknowledge when you've made a decision that's led to a positive outcome, and particularly to document what worked, either formally in kind of a manual or at least put together kind of an annual, hey, this is what's really worked for us this year. So now thinking a little bit about institutionalizing these processes. So one of the things, and many tree boards have these kind of handbooks, is that things can get really personal. And I put sort of the giving tree on here as a picture to just, again, demonstrate that even issues like natural resources, which you think are these sort of concrete, they're natural, they don't relate to kind of human interaction, but they're very emotional. And so depersonalizing personal feelings about these decisions and the ways in which we make decisions can be helpful. So handbooks and manuals can be a really good way to do that. It provides checklists, it provides a way to remove yourself from the emotional process of a decision and say, well, here are the steps we have to take or the things we need to think about. Also, setting those clear goals and, importantly, splitting decisions into small parts. Here's just kind of a cartoon thinking about what trees to plant, for example. So I've sat in on a tree board meeting in Maine where it was a huge goal. It may seem like a very concrete decision, but it's got a lot of small parts. There were location decisions to be made. They had an issue thinking about, well, we need to focus on resilience. We've all decided previously that resilient species are a big goal for our town. They had an old wish list of species. They had people that wanted to introduce new possibilities based on research about species range shifts. There needed to be discussions about budget and priority neighborhoods to consider when planting trees. So often splitting those decisions into small parts, whether that means separate meetings or maybe it means assigning tasks to somebody that say, you two over here are the most knowledgeable about these neighborhoods. How about you come up with the priority neighborhoods? And that becomes its own decision. And that will allow you, when you reassemble and think about that larger decision, will allow you to make the decision faster because you've already checked the boxes, so to speak, on the other small parts of the decision. So back to that decision-making process wheel, thinking about all the things we've talked about with regard to sources of conflict and maybe ways to overcome that process. So here's a suggestion of when the board can come together versus when you can assign things. And it actually works out in kind of a flip-flopping way. So defining the decision to be made, clarifying could happen together. Sometimes the decision to be made comes down from up above, or it's just sort of needs to happen and wasn't decided among the team. But if possible, at least define that decision together. Gathering facts is an easy one to assign, and that relates to the interest conflict, again, harnessing that energy. Brainstorming some of the possible solutions or at least what the outcomes would be of a given decision is best when put together as a team. Assigning people to compare those pros and cons to take the solutions and weigh them often works well. Arguably, the decision will always need to happen together. In some cases, maybe you can appoint somebody to make a decision, but at least that process needs to take place as a team. implementing the decision. That may or may not fall on the shoulders of the board, but that can also be assigned out. But then evaluating and following up is something that's important to do also as a team. So a few final thoughts about managing diverse viewpoints, particularly thinking about decision making and volunteer boards. These 4 high-level bullet points: communication, transparency, adaptability, and education. You may have seen these in other places, in other board capacities, etc. And what I mean by clear communication is separating fact from emotion, but sharing them both, letting people express viewpoints, express special interests, as much as possible encouraging people to think about something as an emotional reaction and being completely okay with that. Sharing decisions widely, I think that one's important, but probably known to most of you, that the more transparent things are and decisions are, the better. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to involve the entire town in a decision-making process. That's why boards exist, but letting them know what's happening. Adaptability, I take to mean assuming you're going to be wrong at least half the time. I do that in a lot of my work and encourage members of my teams and my workshop participants to make that assumption, and then we're all pretty happy with the amount that we can contribute and the amount that we feel right. Education to me means learning from others, but always challenging them, so asking them why or how. You don't have to accept that somebody's version of the truth or somebody's presentation of the facts is correct, but one of the ways you can learn from them is to probe deeper, or to say, you know, I see your point, that's a really interesting perspective, but I want to know more, and I want to know where this comes from or how you got to this place, if it's appropriate, if the team has time to move into that place. Okay, so with that, this next slide rather, the first of 2 with some resources. I didn't necessarily cite these in this presentation, but these are some books, and I think in one case one is even online, that have mostly to do with resolving conflict generally, but I found to be very, very helpful. And then this final slide is are the references that I listed in this presentation. So I think with that, I will let Gwen facilitate the question process, unless I'm just meant to read them.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Emily. This was really helpful with the thoughtful background and strategy examples that you've provided. So we've got one question, so we've got plenty of time for others if folks have more questions for Emily. We've got from Michael, in Vermont, the open meeting law requires that minutes of meetings be published on the town's website within 5 days of a meeting with a quorum. I would not participate in a meeting, sorry, I just lost it, with a quorum and no minutes. Am I wrong? And before you answer, I think it was just this point was referring to the piece that you had talked about with not taking minutes during a time of a difficult conversation, but I'm not sure on that. So Michael, if you want to clarify what you were asking, I'd be happy to, we could figure that out. But I think your point during that, correct me if I'm wrong, was just to focus on the conversation that's really difficult and take the meetings after.
Yes, that is an excellent question, Michael, and I think the answer to the final part of your question is no, you are not wrong. Whatever the law requires you to do as a board, you should absolutely take as first and foremost priority. What I would suggest, though, and what we've had to do in some situations where that's also the case, where anything that a group convenes and to do and says within that convening must be a matter of public record, we can do a couple of things. One, we can choose to summarize a conversation as opposed to transcribe it verbatim. And so to say to people, you can feel free to speak freely, and we as a group are going to summarize the outcome of that conversation in a way that feels comfortable to everybody else. In other cases where there may not be a strict law requirement, I do still believe that allowing that space to express things first and then think about a constructive way to bring in those viewpoints to sort of say, okay, in our prior conversation, we had a few people mention this that they felt pretty strongly about, but not necessarily attributing the statement to each person. And that's a common thing I do in qualitative research too, when you're trying to keep relative anonymity of subjects. There are the transcriptions that everybody, or excuse me, that I as a researcher can see, and then there's the summary where I can say, 2 people from our board felt this way about this topic. But that may be, you will know more than I do about the open meeting law in Vermont. That may or may not be an option for you, in which case you'll just have to ignore that bullet point.
Great, thank you. If there's no other questions, at this time, I'd just really like to thank you, Emily, for your thoughtful background and strategies and examples. We will have this recording up by the end of the week. And with that, we hope that you all have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gwen.
All right, take care.